Hi folks, so what I'm going to do in this video lecture just now is just catch up on the things that didn't upload from the first class and also go over the things that you missed in the second part of class from this week, the People of Texas Politics. So I'm just going to run through this real quick. Obviously we'll be missing out in a discussion from this week, but that's just part of the course. So the first person we talked about that we missed was Dwight Eisenhower, the first president with Texas ties. And the ties that Dwight Eisenhower had with Texas were that he was born here. He was born in Denison, Texas, up in the north of the state, on October 14th, 1890. But when he was 1 year old, nearly two, his family moved to Abilene, Kansas, and that's the town in the state he's more closely associated with. He returned to Texas during World War I, although he didn't see action during World War I. But by World War II, obviously, he'd been promoted. He was assigned to the General Staff in D.C., later went on to be the Supreme Allied Commander, and he was subsequently the military governor of the occupied zone based in Frankfurt in Germany. In 1955, he suffered a heart attack. What's interesting about Eisenhower and the next president we'll be talking about, LBJ, is that both of them suffered ill health as a result of their heavy smoking. So while Eisenhower was out of commission after suffering his heart attack, his post was covered by Richard Nixon, his vice president. His major accomplishments as president include the 1956 interstate highway system. You'll all be familiar with that. I'm sure everyone's traveled on at least 2 or 3 interstates. With relevance to the ongoing Supreme Court issue, Eisenhower actually appointed 5 justices to the Supreme Court, which is the most out of any recent president. Typically, a president appoints 2 or maybe 3. A couple of interesting things relevant to his presidency is that he was the last president to oversee expansion. Both Alaska and Hawaii joined the Union under his watch. He was the first president that was subject to the 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951. That's limited the president to 2 terms. And he was also the first president to benefit from the Former President's Act, which is basically what you probably assume it is. It's an act that deals with security, a pension, basically the pension plan for the presidents. So the second Texan president, before we went on to talk about the 2 Bushes, which I think you got in the previous video, was Lyndon Baines Johnson, born in Stonewall, Texas, named after Stonewall Jackson, the famous Confederate leader. Tiny town, population just over 500, a little bit to the west of Austin, which is where you'll find LBJ's National Park. He moved to Houston, taught at Sam Houston High School, and by 1937 was running for Congress in the 10th Congressional District. In 1941 he ran for Senate, but lost to the then Governor W. Lee O'Daniel. And the previous year had joined the U.S. Naval Reserve. He saw action during the war. He spent the first period of the war in Texas, but then went to Australia and saw action in New Guinea, and received the Silver Star for his efforts in combat. After return from the war, in 1948, he contested the Senate again and won, and by 1952, 4 years later, became the Senate Democratic leader. 8 years after that, he was elected as both vice president and senator, and he had asked the state of Texas to change the law for him to enable him to run for both vice president and senator. If anyone has been following the current election, you will be aware that when Marco Rubio dropped out of the Republican race, he is now going to be out of work in January because he's not contesting his Senate seat. In 1963, after JFK was shot dead in Dallas, LBJ was inaugurated on a plane on the way to Dallas. And during his presidency, he oversaw a reasonably healthy economy with low unemployment, the escalation of the Vietnam conflict. He was responsible for the Voting Rights Act, a lot of civil rights developments during his presidency. And interestingly, 1968 introduced the Gun Control Act. So the last year of his presidency, the 1968 election was won by Richard Nixon. The 68 Gun Control Act was in response to the high-profile assassinations that took place during the 1960s, notably JFK, JFK's brother Bobby, as well as Martin Luther King. So these all contributed to the 1968 Gun Control Act. So after we talked about the two Bush presidents, we went on to talk about the Texas senators. And the two current senators are obviously Ted Cruz, who was a Category 1 senator, which means he's due for election in 2018, and John Cornyn, who just won his last election in 2014, so his next election is going to be 2020. The Category 3 senators are the ones who are up for election right now. So when Cornyn was elected in 2014, he was the Senate he was the Senate Minority Whip prior to election, and after the election became the Senate Majority Whip. Oops. Sorry about that. We'll go with him first. He's the senior senator, just because he's been in the Senate longer and he's older. But the reason he's senior is because he's more experienced. John Cornyn was born in Houston, went to college in San Antonio at Trinity. Initially, he was a district judge in San Antonio and was then elected to the Texas Supreme Court in 1990. You see this pattern of lawyers and lawmakers becoming politicians. He ran for Attorney General in 1998, and we talked before about the runoff primaries. The runoff primaries are quite important when you look at these lower level elections, the state elections. Cornyn finished second in the primary for Attorney General in 1998, but the person who finished in first place didn't have a majority. So the runoff primary brought Cornyn from second place into first place. So like I mentioned in class, it was important that he was people's second choice. If they were voting for the third or the fourth person, Cornyn was their second choice, and that's how he ended up winning the Republican nomination. He was the second Republican to be Texas's Attorney General. Obviously, since then, we've only had Republican Attorney Generals. And he was involved in a controversy in 1999 over a number of false drug convictions that had taken place in Talia, Texas. So if you're interested in John Cornyn, or you're interested in the way that the law works, you can look up the Talia, Texas drug conviction cases from 1999. Cornyn did not investigate those in his role as Attorney General, which people argued he should have. In 2002, despite those controversies, he ran for Senate and ran against Ron Kirk, the Democratic candidate, who was running on a very progressive platform. Now, while Kirk was running on a progressive platform, Cornyn was cozying up to big business, as we've mentioned before, as Republicans sometimes tend to do, and actually took money from Enron for his 2002 campaign. In 2008, he ran against veteran and former House Representative Rick Noriega, a Hispanic candidate for the Democrats, and Cornyn won by 1 million votes. And in 2014, he won by 1.3 million votes, although that election only saw a 33% turnout. So, what's Cornyn famous for? Well, one thing he's famous for is in the same-sex marriage debate. He made a speech about a man wanting to marry a turtle, which obviously made a lot of satire shows like the Daily Show. He's very anti-abortion. He is against background checks for gun ownership. He is pro-tax cuts. He received an NRA A rating. And actually, he voted against Ted Cruz's bill to limit the federal debt ceiling. So when people talk about Ted Cruz's inability to engage with members of the Senate, there's an example of that. So on to Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, as we know, was born in Calgary. Went to school in Houston, in Katy, and in Houston.